They're still there, the totem poles and house remains of Northwest Coast Indians, still present in original locations. Not many, and tilting and moldering back into the forest, but what testimony to the past. Here's a house plank. Its groove is a perfect 3 fingers wide and 3 deep. Such planks at roof and ground levels held wall boards set vertically into the grooves. Think of the problems of raising timbers this size and fitting them perfectly. Solid cedar roof beams 45 feet long span the houses front to back. The effectiveness of these people's tools and the human skill in using the tools are remarkable.
These are the Queen Charlotte Islands off the North British Columbia coast, legendary home of the Haida Indians. Here their proud heritage still proclaims itself in cedar, a wood that lasts extraordinarily well. This village is, or was, Ninstance. It is located on Anthony Island, at the southern tip of the Queen Charlottes. A century ago, Haida Indians abandoned it because of smallpox brought by newcomer white mariners. All along the coast, epidemics killed half or even 2/3 of village populations. People fled. Forest began its reclamation. This trip was an assessment. York Edwards, director of the British Columbia Provincial Museum in Victoria, Dr. Richard Doherty of Washington State University, and Jim Haggerty, museum archaeologist. Also present were Ruth Kirk and husband Louis, Northwest writer, photographer, filmmaker team, Richard Wilson, Haida Indian, and Richard Beecham, Provincial Museum conservator. Over 20 years ago, poles in good enough condition to withstand the handling were salvaged by the Provincial Museum and the University of British Columbia Museum. Other poles had been taken out even earlier. Those remaining today are becoming nurse logs for oncoming generations of spruce and salal. They are split by roots, upholstered and overweighted by saplings.
Here is one of the world's great art styles. Go to Ninstance and feel the shivers dance along your spine, and you're caught up in the dilemma. Who owns such art? Is its care the sole responsibility of those whose direct line ancestors first gave it life? If so, should Beethoven be played only in Germany? Or should everybody outside Italy let the Sistine Chapel collapse? Perhaps because, after all, representative Italian art exists in museums anyway. Obviously, Haida Indians, all Indians, have a special claim here, and Haida permission is required to visit the old villages. But Anthony Island is provincial parkland, and perhaps this means a responsibility to Indian kids not yet born, and to all the rest of us too. The poles and house remains probably could be preserved in place, not taken off to museums. Some say they should not be. There's dignity in death. Others say that's romantic and selfish. It robs the future. Old poles do still stand. This one is hole in the sky. It's said to be the oldest totem pole in good condition, still in its original position. It is Tsimshian. It's about 100 years old, perhaps half its expected life. The village is Kitwankul. Nearby are Kitwanga and Kispiox and Kusan. All are on the Skeena River near Hazelton, British Columbia. Through contracts between the villages and the Provincial Museum, most of these poles were treated and put back up to continue as part of the community's ongoing life. This began as early as 1925. A few, in danger of total decay, were taken to Victoria 15 to 20 years ago, and there museum carvers made exact copies, which were raised here in the villages. At Kitwanga, one pole lay crated for months. The original went to Ottawa. A replacement was sent, beautiful and correct, but fiberglass. Kitwanga people insisted on cedar. This one came. Then the proper chief died before it could be raised. That replacement pole had been made here at Kassan. This row of old-style longhouses, newly built, serves as a culture center. They are part of a splendid Indian Renaissance program, replete with a dance troupe, an art school, and this already famous group of carvers and printmakers and jewelry makers. The carving school is situated in one of these houses. Wolf House of the Grandfathers is for dance performances. This building, the House of the Distant Past, depicts Tsimshian life before the arrival of Europeans. A woman cooks with hot rocks. A shaman treats a sick person. The figures are life-size, indication of the spaciousness of the cedar dwellings of the past.
New poles still are commissioned by Indian people. Victor Mowat worked on this one to be raised by a woman in Kispiaks. There would be elaborate ceremony, including the wearing of this new blanket, its buttons, pearly reflectors in the firelight. For decades, the Canadian and American governments forbade Indian ceremonies, and art suffered. Now the bans are lifted, and feasting and dancing and carving are resurgent along the coast. Neil Sterrett directs the Kassan revival.
How many people are involved in the project here? How many craftsmen?
We have about 15 full-time craftsmen. These are the people that do masks, poles, jewelry, etc. But there's a total of about 35 people in the area that contribute to the enterprise. And then an interesting aspect is the number of young people, even 10 years old, who carve under the supervision of their father or uncle. And this is, I think this is very encouraging.
And what about with your full-time craftsmen? Had they taken artwork before the Kassan project got started?
No, many of them were carpenters or truck drivers or loggers. Some of them were just out of school, but they weren't necessarily artists, although they had an artistic flair.
This red cedar bear holding a yellow cedar talking stick now graces the Royal Bank in Vancouver. The bank commissioned Kassan master carver Walter Harris for the work. The artistry is sponsored, as was true in the old days too. Only the wealthy could afford monumental art. Only they had prestige worthy of acclaim. Art Sterrett and Vernon Stevens, along with Walter Harris, are the ones who carved the doors of the new University of British Columbia Anthropology Museum in Vancouver. They used cedar from the Queen Charlotte Islands, donated by Rainier, Canada. It was kiln-dried at the university, then came to Kassan as 4x4s, which craftsmen doweled and laminated. The carvers called it the finest wood they'd ever worked, 10 feet long, and without a single knot.
And here's where the doors are now, the UBC Museum. Step inside and you're in this great hall displaying choice pieces from the university collections. This film was taken shortly before the opening in May 1976. Anthony Carter described exhibits which still were being installed. Enormous care was going into the precise placement of poles. These particular ones are from Anthony Island, incidentally. Originally, a chief who could afford a new pole or mask or headdress also could command the time and power to see that it was properly displayed. Museum personnel try to do the same. We look at a wealth of raven headdresses like this and apply the word art as something extra in life. But for Northwest Coast peoples, art and life were inseparable. Art made visible the invisible. How else could you recognize the spirits and know the order of the world? How else be reminded of human social structure? These were a people with strong traditions. Their culture withstood the disruption of Europeans' arrival. It continues today.
Superb carving also has long served utilitarian purposes along the Northwest Coast, or in this case, utilitarian canoes adapted for sport. Racing cedar dugouts is popular with Quinault and Quileute and Hoh people on Washington's Olympic Peninsula. Also, until very recently, fishermen commonly tended their nets from traditional dugouts. We were all the time going places in canoes, is how one Olympic Peninsula Indian elder remembers her childhood. The statement is typical, for these were a cosmopolitan people. They traveled widely, often spoke more than one language, knew customs other than their own. Interestingly, salmon probably directly affected the social structure of the past, as well as provided a foundation for the economy. To the north, the salmon runs become increasingly concentrated in time, and along with this, traditional social structure depends increasingly on rank. High rank, great prestige, were the means by which a chief could efficiently direct his people to catch and process and store hordes of salmon, available only for a few days a year. To the south, there was more time to fish and an easier-going prestige system. On the north coast, salmon were available a short time, and social ranking, year-round, was more rigid.
Coast culture is still intact, even to the old-style contact between tribes. A family party at Hoh River today has the Hudsons, Hoh Quileutes, cooking the fish and hosting, and the Washington family, Salish people from the Love Me Reservation, dancing. Present, too, the Williams family, Nootka people from Vancouver Island, relatives of the Hudsons. Potlatching again is on. Families unite across an international boundary that is alien to them in any case. Northwest Coast canoes always have been made this way, by hand from a cedar log. Given reasonable care, a good one will last 50 years. Ted Hudson learned canoe making from his father. Each generation always has seen to it that the next knows the heritage. Canoe makers hollowed the logs, then flared the canoe's sides. They'd fill a new canoe with water and add hot rocks. This softened the wood so that the sides could be spread. The spreading, rather than carving the wood across the grain, made a much stronger canoe. The practiced eye of the carver produced the beautiful lines and the great seaworthiness.
In the old days, ocean canoes were big enough to hold 30 people. They carried seafarers along this whole coast from northern California to southern Alaska. On the outer coast of Vancouver Island, just south of Nootka Sound, the Hesquiat Indians and the BC Provincial Museum are conducting an archaeological project. Dr. Doherty, archaeologist from Washington State University, and Ruth and Louis Kirk, journalists, were invited there by Jim Haggerty, museum archaeologist directing the project. Several sites have been excavated, this one by Neil Crozier, working with Hesquiats, Terence Savas, and Senan Charlson. Hesquiats today live apart from each other and from their home beaches and waters. As canoe fishermen and fur seal and whale hunters, they did well for centuries. Then they got modern boats and lost everything. Canoes could be pulled onto the beach during storms, but the waves battered white-style boats to pieces. Hesquiat Harbor offers too little protection for modern boats. Bear tracks along the beach tell of its remoteness. No roads reach Hesquiat, even today. Nonetheless, caves used for generations as burial grounds were being violated by vandals seeking souvenirs. Hesquiat people were alarmed. They had moved, but their tie here was not broken. Archaeology seemed an answer. Recover the cultural record held within the earth, and the articles themselves, along with the human story they represent, would be safe. The Hesquiats knew they couldn't undertake archaeology alone, and that only it could give them many chapters of their own past. Without scientific recovery before vandals completely wrecked the chance forever, knowledge of roots would be limited to what the elders could remember.
So they turned to the Provincial Museum for help, and Gay Bohm, zoologist, and Jim Haggerty and the Hesquiats have been working together ever since. The people had to move from here. They were catapulted into the 20th century, and now they live scattered in Victoria and Alberni and so on. But this still is home, and they hope someday to return. Roads are getting closer. The remoteness soon may end. Impromptu conferences kept springing up. Gay started telling how shells indicate the time of year that people were living at a particular place. A cockle has concentric lines running parallel with its edge. These are growth rings, something like those for a tree. Wide bands form in summer when the clam is feeding well. Narrow bands form in winter. Break a shell and polish the cross-section, and you find very fine lines. They are hard to see with the unaided eye, but show clearly under a microscope. The lines, or bands, represent shell growth at the mantle edge each time the clam fed. Usually this means 2 bands a day, marking the 2 high tides. Apply this to archaeology, and you have a way of knowing probable season hundreds, thousands of years ago. Band width at a shell edge indicates the last feeding time, and that tells the season in which the clam may have been gathered. This points to the likely time of year that people were occupying a particular site and using the clams. Here is Hesquiat Village, the last, so far, in a long sequence of villages. There's a haunting poignancy. Abandonment began in the 1950s. Hesquiats built a new village at Hot Springs Cove, a short way south. It had just begun to flourish when a tidal wave from the 1964 Alaska earthquake destroyed the new village. The people again had to move. Now the archaeology project rallies spirit and gives a sense of unity. As they can, Hesquiat elders come to the museum in Victoria to see their materials, and Hesquiat young people work with the archaeologists to compile and analyze data. Mechanical work on soil samples includes putting them through a series of sieves with progressively finer mesh. This permits calculating the percentage of shell fragment to bone fragment, for example. The fine sieve even permits recovering material otherwise lost. Herring bones have been found this way, where all other indication of a herring fishery at a particular site had gone undetected.
In the osteology lab, James Amos sorts animal bones from the summer's excavation. Hesquiat elders enjoy watching, and with each piece he picks up, Alice Paul and Mary Amos call out, bird bone, fish bone, dogfish spines. Most of us wouldn't know one category from another, but the elders recognize each instantly. Gay Bohm, zoologist, likes to sort through bones collected at Hesquiat with the elders, because often someone seeing a bone this way will think of where they used to hunt a certain kind of animal, or what techniques they used. And so the knowledge builds, an amalgam of science and memory. Archaeology, of course, is not limited to prehistory. It deals with all the human record within the ground. People without a written language of their own often have detailed oral records passed from generation to generation with great accuracy, but they cannot go to a library to look up their history. Now, they can come to the Provincial Museum.
You watch their faces, and you feel the cultural past of us all, for we are one human family. Totem poles rotting in the Queen Charlotte's burial caves belong to the same urge to reach beyond our lonely, individual selves. And along the northwest coast, what a gorgeous setting mankind has for this reaching beyond. Here it's the Hoko River, traditional Macaw Indian territory on the north tip of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. This, too, is the location of a joint archaeological project, one between the Macaw Indian tribe and Washington State University. For generations, the river has been a macaw salmon fishing station, and offshore are halibut banks. Deposits along the riverbank and eroded down into the river hold the residue of the past. A scuba diver with a suction pipe sends river-bottom materials up into a screen box for scrutiny, and along the bank itself, archaeologists hose down through layers that radiocarbon date back to nearly 3,000 years ago. Macaws often visit from Nia Bay, only 16 miles away, so that project director Dr. Dale Crows can update them on the latest finds: basketry, fiber cordage, wooden fishhooks. At Hoko, the heritage in cedar and other woods usually quickly lost to decay has survived through the millennia because deposits are constantly wet. Artifacts are fragile but intact and can be preserved.
Part of a sturdy basket that probably once held fish. A fragment of a red cedar box. A barbed wooden point, most likely for spearing salmon. These are straightforward utilitarian items. But archaeology is not a hunt for treasure in gold or jewels. Its quest is cultural heritage. To understand how a fish hook like this must have worked in the past, Ricky Hoff, one of the WSU archaeologists at Hoko River, made exact copies. He asked macaw fishermen about bait, which traditionally has been squid. They taught him how to cut it and put it on the barb so that in the water it would resemble a living squid. Macaws also told Hoff where the fishing banks are off the river mouth and what season the halibut are present, for halibut vertebrae are among the most common in the archaeological deposits. Kelp, seaweed, supplied fish line in the old days. None has been preserved in the 2,700-year-old Hoko deposits, but it probably is what was used for bottom fish. Indians alive today remember hearing about kelp as line, and museum collections commonly include specimens. This fishing went on for several months, but Ricky Hoff was learning more about the nuisance of drying and tending kelp line between times of use than about what fish would bite on these hooks.
Next step was to abandon the Strait of Juan de Fuca and try the Seattle Aquarium. Macaws and archaeologists used the replicated gear, baited the old way, and fished in the main tank, thanks to the generous cooperation of aquarium officials. What they caught, they released. The first fish hooked was a salmon, then a wall-eyed pollock. Perch also took the hook, and dogfish, cod, rockfish, and sculpin. A wider range of fish than had been expected. Ultimately, Ricky Hoff even successfully landed a flounder while fishing in the strait.
ancient fishing gear found at Hoko River, which especially excited the macaws, is this: a net with sandstone weight still attached. It may have been a gill net, or perhaps it belonged to some fish trap system of directing fish that had entered the river to spawn. The net is made of spruce limb. Microscopic identification is not just to species, but to the part of the tree used, distinguishable by precise cell characteristics. James Barber, botanist, used the WSU's scanning electron microscope for this work. Minute specimens from the ancient artifacts give a three-dimensional look at wood structure. Delicate cell walls are unaltered while being prepared for the microscope. Polaroid pictures provide added convenience. They show not only the wood structure, but also the fungus that could cause total decay if preservation weren't swift and correct. To understand the Hoko net as fully as possible, Dr. Crows prepared spruce twigs the old way by pulling them through a split stick to get off bark, then splitting them into withes. These small twigs, convenient to gather hurriedly, didn't produce pieces as wide as those of the actual net. That suggests that limbs rather than twigs probably were the material originally used. Until Barber's microscopic identification of spruce, it had been supposed that the net was of cedar root, but limb material is stronger than root and soaks up water less readily. This probably favored the net's holding up well through continued use.
Remarkable at Hoko were 12 little knives like this one, stone flakes still in their handles. They are thousands of years old. This one is brand new. Dr. Jeff Flanagan, Washington State University archaeologist specializing in stone tools and their use, made 2,500 tests to find the exact way Hoko knife makers had flaked their knife blades. Only this way yields flakes that exactly match the old ones, even under the scanning microscope. Flakes like these, microliths, are common at archaeological sites throughout the North American West. But only at Hoko are they found still in their handles, cedar splints that have lasted through the long years. Dr. Flanagan and others used the replicated knives in various ways, woodworking, basketry, and they did not work well or match the wear pattern of the old knives. Then macaw women, experts at butchering fish, tested them, found they worked splendidly, and they taught Dr. Flanagan and Dr. Crows to cut fish. This fish was a halibut that had been frozen and thawed. Its slightly mushy flesh, surrendering to the sharp edge of a quartz flake bound in cedar, speaks clearly of time and life along this northwest coast of ours. It tells of heritage, of memory and tradition still alive, and of new scientific understanding.